Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Over the past 2 years, I've been working on the Rosalie Whyel collection from her legendary museum that stood in Bellevue, Washington from about 1990 to 2012. And everyone's heard the stories, and probably everybody who's listening to this knows the legend of the Rosalie Whyel Museum and the personality in herself as well, because she was so interactive daily with welcoming people from all over the world. And the auction events that we've recently held of this museum after Rosalie's passing in 2023 have really cast a light onto the importance of all that she contributed during those years, and was a beautiful send-off to her story, her contributions to the consciousness of the doll world, and to the protection of the items that she relished for so many years and shared with everyone from across the world. These auctions became not just an auction of stuff. They were a celebration of her life and a celebration of the incredible vision she had to recognize the importance of items and recognize the importance of certain aspect of dolls that really had not been seen before or recognized before by a number of people. Now that these two auctions, both held in January of 2024 and then very recently in January of 2025, really have left me with a lot of thoughts and a lot of understanding of new important movements and trends in the world of doll collecting that she gave us. And I'm calling this 10 takeaways from the Rosalie Whyel auctions of 24 and 25 to share with others my thoughts and things that I've learned from this process over the past 2 years, and how I think it's going to affect future generations of collectors in the years to come. So sit back and listen to my 10 takeaways. And I think a lot of these will as well kind of affect your own viewpoint of collecting. You will recognize things within yourself, but you may see some ideas and some steps and patterns forward in your own collecting that will be helpful, that we've recognized that Rosalie gave us via these two sales. So what happened at these two auctions? What transpired at these two momentous occasions? And I should say, these were not just any sales. These two auctions were groundbreaking in a number of respects. Part one, held in January of 24, yielded the highest grossing auction results of any doll auction in world history. Part two had the highest engagement and number of bids ever registered before at a Theriault auction. So that puts into perspective some of the data or stats behind it. But there was a lot more that really came out of those weekends that I think are going to stick with me for a long time. The takeaway number one, love. I have been on the podium for auctions for a lot of years since I came back into the business after college in the late 80s. I have been the grand marshal to some pretty legendary collections, and I've seen this before. I've experienced what a crowd is like when a person who is truly beloved is represented as to their vision and their dolls. A few examples that I can think of right off the top of my head: Mildred Seeley, a perfect example. I remember that auction in Las Vegas in 2003, I believe, somewhere around there, that literally hundreds and hundreds of people had flown in from all over the world to not just pay respects, not just to buy a doll, but to protect and own one of Millie's dolls, because she had meant so much to their collecting and their life, and educated them and shared with them and laughed with them. that she was a beloved friend in many cases of people from Japan and Australia and Europe, all over the US. So that when somebody came to this, they weren't even what I would call always an active or major collector, but they were stepping out to buy something to protect from her because she meant so much. I remember a woman in Pennsylvania who was just a doll maker and took seminars with Millie. And the doll making saved her life in many cases. She had been suffering from a number of issues over the years and health problems. And this was her elixir. This was her moment of joy. And Millie gave that to her. So she ended up buying 2 of the A marks from Mildred Seeley, if you can believe it. And she wasn't even an antique doll collector, which I love as a great story. You saw it with Shirley Temple when we did Shirley Temple's auction. Now, people didn't necessarily know Shirley Temple or were personal friends of hers, but everybody was kind of a friend in a way by extension of Shirley Temple. And that love I speak of the auction very much showed how she impacted people's lives over the years. Then we get to Rosalie and we see that same incredible feeling from a crowd that they wanted to give back to a woman who had given so much to them. Her willingness to share, invest in her building and the dolls and open it every day and to be there and tour them around and always welcoming every collector from around the world, to always be kind, to always engage. And so the return is people poured from all over the world into bidding platforms and into the auctions that Theriault's held of her collections to protect and own something that represented this woman that they all loved, Rosalie Whyel. And it's interesting. So one of the takeaways for all of you as a collector is to consider that you're doing great things within dolls. You're being a positive force. You're sharing and educating and having just fun with other collectors is an incredible way for you to build a brand. Now, you're probably thinking, brand? Why would I want to build a brand? I'm not Apple. I'm not Amazon. I'm just a doll collector. Well, everybody can at some point in their life create a sort of personality within doll collecting that people identify with and recognize. So example would be Estelle Johnston, who was a collector I greatly admired for many, many years. Now, Estelle spent her life not only collecting dolls, but doing very deep research and then writing really fascinating articles, many times featuring dolls that she owned. Now, this was a great exercise in collector branding because when we sold Estelle Johnston's dolls about 2015, you would be shocked at all of the people who came because they loved Estelle for her articles and they loved those dolls that she wrote about. That's part of creating a brand. Now, it doesn't even have to be international. It doesn't have to be you're writing necessarily articles, though that's a great start. It can be just local. It can be just hosting doll club meetings, sharing your collection with people, being a positive force, making friendships in your region that stick and stand and inspire collectors so that later on, your collection becomes kind of an extension of you. And that's an important thing to remember. Collections can be an extension of your own personality and your own positiveness. And the end result is people will want to protect those dolls even more in the future. So love was a huge takeaway of Rosalie Whyel's events. And I have not seen anything quite like it other than maybe Shirley Temple, Mildred Seeley, and then even on a regional level, some collectors like Sandy Kralowitz, who was such a force in Phoenix and Houston where she lived, and everybody loved and adored Sandy. You see it in all of these collectors, both on a larger scale and a smaller scale, and it's something every collector should work to aspire to. So takeaway number 2, the stories. Now, I have taken this on in my own life as far as expressing what is, I believe, is truly the value of a doll, and that is the story that it tells. But Rosalie, I think, brought it about before anyone else really did, in understanding that the stories can be even simple ones. It doesn't have to be something fantastical or intense or intrigue. It doesn't have to be that Mary Todd Lincoln owned this doll and here's a photograph of her with it. It can also just be that Mabel owned this doll as a young girl and had it her whole life until she passed away. That's the beauty of Rosalie's contributions, in that she saw relevance and she saw importance in every doll having a story that had some meaning to someone else. So while we would say, well, okay, so somebody told you that this was their doll and they had it and got it in 1902 and held on to it for their whole life, how is that really important? Well, it is. And Rosalie was the one who really took the time to understand and write down these stories and preserve them, believing that everybody's story with a doll, no matter who they are, is important to them and should be important to future collectors as those stories continue on. One of the dolls I remember in part one of the auctions in January of 24 was the very final lot of the sale. I confess I actually broke out in tears, probably because I had been on the podium for, I think, 18 hours over 2 days. So maybe breaking out in tears of exhaustion, but breaking out in tears nonetheless of the emotions of this last doll and what I was witnessing. It was a standard German bisque Kamer and Reinhardt child doll, beautifully costumed, all original, but it had a wonderful story of the woman who had owned this doll since she was a child and passed away at 100 years old. Now, she had sold it to Rosalie for the museum specifically, and Rosalie documented the whole story of her and when she passed away, and it stayed with the doll. It wasn't just an oral history that was lost. It stayed with the doll and was documented. And when we sold that, there was a beautiful moment of this story coming to life, in that people really did recognize how wonderful it was. And a doll that normally would have brought $600 or $700 any other day started there and ended up at $5,000 for a very standard Kamer and Reinhardt child doll that had the most wonderful history to it, thanks to Rosalie's preservation of it. So this is an important takeaway for every collector today, that no matter how, I hate to use the word mundane, but how standard a story may seem, because every doll had an original owner. Every doll had somebody that it meant something to, but being able to document even the simple ones really does add a bit of intrigue and a bit of romance to a particular item. So make sure to write these down. Make sure to preserve them. Don't just assume that you'll always be able to spread that story from an oral perspective. Make sure you've documented it properly, like Rosalie did on every single doll, no matter what original owner came in, no matter if it was a Bilo or some well-worn teddy bear. She documented who was the owner, who had this doll, what was their life, where were they from. This is an incredible, valuable lesson in collecting. And as well, I think makes collecting more fun. If you can actually engage with some of these family people and show them empathy and care for a piece, even if it's common, that it has a story and you will preserve it, that is a beautiful thing, and something I think Rosalie gifted all of us with in understanding. So provenance and stories, write them down, preserve them, appreciate them. The third takeaway from this auction was really interesting for me as I talk about and discuss both in these podcasts and lectures that I do about how the markets have changed over the years. And I have talked in the past about how in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s, we really had sort of a framework of collecting that centered around what I call the standards, the classic dolls that everybody knew, everybody could find information on, everybody identified easily. They were recognizable from a pricing standpoint. They were safe. They were secure. But there was an entire wealth of dolls out there that were more esoteric, let's call it, or a little bit off the beaten path of those standards. And people were insecure a lot of times buying these dolls, what to pay for them, didn't even know if they wanted them. They really went underappreciated. Rosalie Whyel, I think, was one of the very early collectors to recognize the importance of a lot of fringe categories and see that there is even more importance in a lot of these dolls simply because they are rarer and they probably have interesting stories that connect with people on an everyday basis that are far more apparent than you might find in, let's just say, a standard Tête Jameau, which you see all the time. Examples, Izana Walker. Izana Walker, you're probably saying, okay, well, that was always kind of popular. Sure, it was. But Izana Walker has taken on a whole nother level. In the 80s and 90s, they were loved and beloved dolls, but they were thought of as early American cloth dolls. And there was a lot of trepidation as to what you would pay for an Izana Walker because they were not classics. They weren't bisque. They were a little bit folky and Americana-ish. So people didn't really go big on Izana Walkers value-wise until they really started developing an understanding of their importance in American history as one of the really first iconic American doll makers. Interestingly enough, one of the first female entrepreneurs in America in which you could make dolls. It was one of the entry points for a female entrepreneur to start a business. So they have taken off thanks to people like Rosalie, who really displayed them, showed them, talked about them, and expressed the importance they have as Americana. Interestingly enough, it's really spread all over the world. One of the places that I just don't understand, but they are like cult dolls beyond belief, is Russia. Russia is crazy for Izana Walkers. But these two auctions showed the level of which these dolls have risen in the minds of collectors. It doesn't just have to be a classic pretty bisque doll anymore. People are seeing the importance of other things. Izana Walkers in these two auctions were setting world record after world record. We had a black variation of an Izana Walker in part 1 in 24 that ended up at $80,000 and broke a world record at the time. And then in this past auction in January of 25, in part 2, we had another Izana Walker, a more classic example, you could call it, with the double curls. And this one ended up bringing $85,000, breaking that record, showing you the level of confidence that collectors have for these more esoteric pieces, for these more folky items, in even extending beyond, in some cases, the classics that everyone had felt secure on before. Another doll that comes to mind in part 2, very fresh, just a few days off the podium from that auction, was the Native American Martha Chase. That was a sort of one-off. No one has ever seen one before that was actually colored in the style of Native Americans and was probably utilized in hospitals that catered to Native Americans and training nurses. These were hospital babies. Hospital babies by Martha Chase are fairly standard. You find them all the time. They bring a few $100s, but a Native American Martha Chase you'd never really noticed before. I've never seen one. Rosalie recognized the importance of this doll, and now collectors are rising up to the occasion of seeing that they have become really important. They are not aesthetically the Jameaus and Brews that you imagine, but they have really important history and really important place within doll collecting that is resulting in record prices. It ended up bringing $30,000 over an estimate, I believe, of like $2,000 to $3,000, and ended up going to a prominent museum. There was a small English wooden doll that I still remember being on the podium and seeing the emotions and the bidding and the energy when this came up. Now, English woodens years ago had a cult following, but again, they have a bit more of an esoteric flair to them. So they didn't appeal to everyone like a Jameau or a Brew might. But This particular one was even more sort of off the realm of even a standard English wooden that you might imagine. It was a smaller one, almost a palm of your hand, maybe a little bit bigger, and very early, like late 1600s. No, it's not a classic, beautiful doll, but it had a wonderful presence and such an early, important feel to it. And this doll, I believe, was estimated at like $8,000 to $12,000, the type of thing that in the 80s or 90s, it might have brought a couple of $1,000s if you were lucky. And it ended up bringing $70,000 in these sales. Another example of something that Rosalie recognized early on, brought out to the market in the museum to educate people, show them the prominence and importance of this. And it really stuck over these years to the point that people now are flocking to these more fringe items. That's what they want. People want interesting. They want different. And they're not afraid anymore to pay the price, to go to battle if necessary, to get something that they may never see again. And that's the interesting thing about these Isana Walkers and that small English wooden doll or the native Martha Chase. You will probably never find another one exactly like that, where with Bruce, and please, for those who love Bruce, I love them too. I think it's one of the most beautiful French bébés ever created, but you will see other ones very, very similar to it. A lot of these dolls, you'll never find one exactly like it, but it can even be common dolls that are in an unusual setting or an unusual, let's call it, framework. I remember these little Albus dolls in part 2 just a few days ago here in 2025 that were very rare, but still not outrageously rare, black variations of Albus dolls. What made this lot unusual was that they were all done in this really interesting vignette of a hospital setting. So little beds where these little Albus dolls laid in them as patients. And then they had like a doctor and a nurse as well. All of them Albus, I believe Simon and Halbig or Kestner, I'm not remembering exactly. But Rosalie bought these from us, I think in the late 80s, and nobody really paid a lot of attention to them back then. Now they were heavily fought over. We had a number of active bidders going on these, and they ended up soaring from an estimate, I believe, of like $2,000 to $2,500. They ended up going for, are you ready, $34,000, which was astounding. But when you put it into perspective, again, interesting is where it's at now. People are not afraid to pay top prices for unique items that they may never see again. And I've never seen another set like this before. A little all original scene in a hospital of little black Albus, and probably never will again. So why not? I love it. Rosalie gave people the confidence that it's good to go for these things, and you should go hard if you have it and can get it, because it may be the last chance you ever have to find objects exactly like this. So great takeaway is the simplest of things are becoming the most desirable. I'm talking about some of these prices, and I know that it's exciting and it's reaffirming for the market and for collectors to say, wow, look at the energy and the passion out there and the prices being paid for dolls. This is great. It's fantastic. I'm with you. We need that. But running an auction house and being an auctioneer, I am actually kind of the antithesis of most, in that most auction houses love to promote and brag about the big record prices that they get. And you'll see press releases and all these things. And I think that's fine. It's an approach. But I also like to equally point out to collectors some of the great bargains that are in a sale. And you don't see many auction houses wanting to promote that there were good buys in the auction, but I think it's positive. I think it's a great opportunity for people to be able to see that there is something for everyone. Otherwise, it gets shrouded in all of these big record prices, and collectors are falsely left to believe that, oh, well, I guess there's nothing else for me. I guess I'm priced out of the market. No, you're not. There are great opportunities in every auction. There was I loved it, a little wooden doll, early wooden doll old lady in a shoe with her little wooden children. That was in part 2 that went for $250. That's an affordable, wonderful early piece that was a beloved little item in the museum that was approachable for everybody. But one of the dolls that really intrigued me that I thought was a fantastic buy, probably one of the buys of the decade, if you want my personal opinion, was the Cameron Reinhardt 104. Now, this is a doll that only a few being 2 to 6, and I would say there's probably 5 or 6, I don't remember exactly the count, that are known to exist in the world right now in collections. Gail Cook has one as an example, and the great collector Liz Krupp. It's a doll that has in the past well exceeded $100,000 and rarely ever comes up. Now, this 104 from Rosalie's collection, she had bought it originally from Richard Wright. It had been in his personal collection for many years. And then he sold it directly to Rosalie, and she had it on display in the museum. It ended up going for $38,000. Now, some of you are probably saying, Stuart, $38,000, that's a lot of money. And yes, it is. But I'm saying relative to where the value has been for that particular doll in the past, it was an absolute steal. And if character dolls came back into trend again, and we saw a sort of new rising of a lot of collectors of characters like we saw maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s, you could see this doll bring $100,000 to $150,000 easily. So it was a moment, it was an opportunity, and luckily there was somebody who was opportunistic in recognizing that and jumping on it. So this brings up a really important lesson and takeaway for every collector out there. When you see an auction catalog like these part 1 and part 2 for Rosalie Whyel, and you're looking and being wowed by all the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 dolls in there, and you're thinking, well, I would never have a chance on any of these things. I could never find a good buy. They'll all go crazy pricing, bidders from all over the world to compete with. Forget it. I'm not even going to bother looking at those. I'm just going to pick out a few things that I think I might have a chance on. So you pick out and you do your little bookmarking like you always do in the catalogs, and you pick out 4 or 5 things that you're going to go for. And that's what you kind of pay attention to the auction. And then you sort of half pay attention to the rest of the sale, or sometimes say, oh, well, the next items, there's no chance I'll ever have on these dolls, so I'm just going to go make a peanut butter sandwich. I have no concept of how I came up with peanut butter sandwich, but let's just go with it in this example. And so you go off and you make a peanut butter sandwich, and that Cameron Reinhardt 104 comes up and it sells for $38,000. And you come back and you sit down and you're like, no, I would have bid that. Oh my goodness, what happened? Collectors should enter the idea of an auction as being an opportunity 100%. Every doll has a possibility. Every doll could slip through the cracks and be a good buy for somebody. And you need to be ready for that moment. Now, I'm not saying on that 104 that if you had bid $39,000, that the other person would not have bid $40,000, and it might have just gone up from there. Very probable it could have. However, you don't know unless you try. And on the same token, you might have found that that collector would have stopped at $39,000 or $40,000, and you would have bought it at $39,000 and still had one of the buys of the decade. So look at everything with opportunity. Don't be pessimistic. Be optimistic when you go into an auction, and assume that there's going to be something that's going to surprise you. Pay attention to it and be ready for it. A couple of other examples. There was an Oberammergau, which are dolls that I love, these German wooden dolls from the early 1800s. And there was one in part 2 just recently in the beginning of the sale that went for $8,500. Now, this doll is something that could have easily brought on another day $25,000. It was an incredible opportunity that I think was overlooked by people when other things were soaring. This one was wide open and ready. So leave your options open. And this was a great takeaway from these events for me, in that no matter how many of these record-breaking prices we have talked about in both of the Rosalie's auctions, the record-breaking $5 million results for part 1, that was the highest grossing doll auction in world history. All of these facts are interesting and relevant to the big story. But if you dig deep inside, you will find that in all of those auctions, there was something that slipped by every 30 minutes, every hour of those sales that you could have jumped on if you had been more optimistic rather than pessimistic. Takeaway number 5. I have really learned from these events that diversity in collecting is a true advantage you have at the end of your collecting. You've heard me talk about before in one of the podcasts how a good lesson for beginning collectors and new collectors is to really focus in on what you love, that category, and try to get yourself immersed in every aspect of that particular category and focus on it alone. That doesn't mean you can't diversify over time, though. And that doesn't mean you can't diversify even within that category. Diversification of a collection offers you a really unique advantage. And I saw this more and more with the Rosalie Whyel collection, and that there were a lot of dolls that were very, very in demand in the 90s, German characters as an example, that are bringing probably less, in some cases, not all, bringing less today. But that's okay because there was diversification in the collection in that she had other examples, other dolls, like we talked about Isaiah Walker or early English Woodens or those Albus dolls in the hospital setting that are soaring right now because people are after interesting and different. So diversifying your collection allows you the opportunity to own beautiful objects, to maybe sometimes pay a lot for something that you think in the end, I may not get my money back, but that's okay because you diversified and you have other things that you paid very little for that are probably going to soar in value later on in your life. That doesn't mean if you say collect Albus dolls alone, and that was your specialty in your hobby, and you really didn't want to collect French fashions or American cloth or anything else. You really just want to collect Albus. That's fine. Look for diversity within that category because every category offers individual diversity of a genre. And Albus, you could be collecting, you want to collect wrestlers, you want to collect early French type mignonettes, you want to collect classic Kestner and Simon and Halbig Albus dolls. You want to find Albus that have a trousseau perhaps, or in a presentation box, something with history. So diversify within the category is great, but just keep that word in your mind, no matter what you're doing in collecting, diversification, diversity. It is really a key aspect that will help you later on in balancing out the results of your dolls, as it did for Rosalie Whyel's collection. Takeaway number 6 from these 2 weekends is the personal connection that I came out of it with Lily Bates, the great doll artist of the early 20th century, German/Austrian doll artist. Lily Bates was a known figure in the world of dolls, but very, very specialized group of people who kind of followed her work and tended more towards the classic boudoir pieces that she produced of ladies in the 1915 to 1930 period. And this was an awakening for me and has really become an awakening to the entire global doll community of the importance of Lily Bates and her contributions to creativity and doll artistry in this early 20th century shift, let's call it, from the French and the classic German dolls into these new doll makers of the 1920s, who a lot of them were women. That makes it really fascinating for me as well. So Lily really is a story that needs to be told to understand how these dolls have taken on a whole new level of consciousness with collectors everywhere. And it was Rosalie Whyel who unveiled one of Lily's greatest works in a series of, I believe, about 90 one-of-a-kind portrait dolls of 3 different categories that she created in collaboration with the Salzburg Werkstätte in Austria, who did the costumes while she crafted the individual faces and bodies of each of these dolls. One set was women in theater and cinema. One set was children through the ages of time. One set was ethnic couples from different regional areas of the world. We've now offered the two sets, the women of theater, and we've offered the children. And it's incredible to watch this develop in the love of Lily Bates, in that we now have two books that are being written, one in America, one in Europe. We have a documentary film being done that will feature within it the life of Lily Bates as well, as a really important historical figure and her story and struggles during World War II. And it has given this entire new awareness to the importance of these dolls, not only for collectors to buy and enjoy, but for collectors to share as an example of how doll artists and doll makers are really important to the story of our societal development over the past 100 years. And that these are not just people making some dolls. These were true artists, of Lily Bates being one of them. And it is an incredible thing to watch as this grows. Now, in the first part one, the dolls that were featuring women of the stage and women of early cinema were heavily contested and were bringing in the 2,000 or 3,000 range each. Well, that has grown now, because people are learning more and more of the story. And so we have the children in part two, children through the ages of time. The bidding got even more intense, bringing primarily in the 4,000 or 5,000 range, and a few of them actually topping up to $10,000 each. So we're seeing Lily Bates is catching on. Lily Bates is becoming a very important figure. And this was a huge takeaway for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, to be able to witness this and learn her story as well. The seventh takeaway is one that I think is really important for every collector today to recognize in what Rosalie demonstrated and was able to achieve. This was a solo effort, one could say, in that it was the Rosalie Whyel Museum that stood in Bellevue for all those years and had her name on it. But there was a lot more behind the scenes to this museum than just Rosalie. That is, she had something that very few prominent collectors have. Now, a lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. And that is family support. And this is something I really want to talk about here for a few minutes, and helping collectors realize that your potential as a collector greatly increases if you have the support of a family. Rosalie, when she announced out of nowhere that she was going to actually construct and build a museum and house thousands of dolls in Bellevue, Washington, while they were living in Alaska at the time, you could imagine that her family could have said, "What in the world are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" But no, her husband, George, said, "I think it's a great idea. We've been talking about wanting to move down there, and this would give you something really fun to do. Let's do it." Her family not only supported it, thought it was really a great idea, but actually worked in the museum and helped her for years, including her daughter, Shelley, that you've listened to in previous podcasts that I interviewed. They all gave her 100% support on this. They didn't think it was just mom's or my wife's strange little idea of a doll museum or a doll collection, and that's her thing, whatever. They really did support it. They really were behind her in this endeavor. And I think this is an opportunity for collectors to ask themselves, have you really developed and helped your family understand not only what the dolls mean to you, but what the dolls mean to our culture and history, and that they are not just dolls. They are not just playthings. They are figurative art. We talk about wanting to educate the general public, and we are making strides in this effort over the past decade, without a doubt. People are beginning to learn and respect more the idea of a doll as a work of art. It's happening, but it's taking time. But it seems to me we're missing the most obvious and closest approach to this, and that is starting with our own family. If your partner, your husband or your wife don't support your collecting, how are we supposed to get the others to support and understand its importance? So we start with them. They don't have to necessarily want to engage in the collecting part of it with you, though I think it's fabulous. Couples that collect together is a wonderful opportunity, and I'll share in a moment my thoughts on that. But to just at least basically have the respect that what you're doing is something really not just tangible and important in your life, but something that is really important for our culture and our society and the continuing history of this subject. It can extend to your children, supporting that this is not just mom's kind of quirky thing of, oh gosh, her dolls. They go to visit like, oh gosh, you got to go look at that. You don't want to see her dolls. You hear the word creepy or something like that. No, stop allowing that to happen. Start encouraging your family to support you. Start giving them the ammunition themselves to educate others that these dolls are not just important to you, but important to tens of thousands, millions of people across the world. So encourage your family to be a part of your collecting. And if you have a partner, spouse that can really get involved and learn with you, that is a remarkable experience in itself. And I look at collectors like Chuck and Fran Sorolla in San Diego, who have really loved and collected dolls together. They have managed to build, I believe, a better collection because they support each other in their decisions. They encourage each other in what they love and like. And they each have their own little quirks and side angles that allows for that takeaway number 5 we talked about earlier, diversity in a collection. So encourage your family. Rosalie Whyel really did demonstrate for me how the positive feedback from a family in understanding your vision really works well with building a world-class collection. Takeaway number 8, let's go museums. Now, this was a museum collection, so you're thinking, well, yeah. No, how about let's go all the museums who were buying pieces from both parts of these auctions. This was an incredible thing to witness in that I would say, I haven't looked at the exact stats yet, but at this point, about 18 to 20% of the items sold will be going to museums across the world, continuing that journey from Rosalie's original placement to other museums. And I think that is something that Rosalie is looking down and smiling on because they're able to be shared with the world. We talked about Native American Martha Chase example that I discussed. That actually will be going to the Kansas City Toy and Miniature Museum. There were Albus dolls in a hospital setting that we talked about earlier, going to a European museum. It's so exciting. The Tom Thumb. Oh, I love that wax portrait of Tom Thumb that was probably, it was my favorite item of both of the auctions. That's going to be at the Barry Art Museum in Norfolk. We've had for a lot of years museums closing, and you probably have seen Theriault selling a lot of them, from the Lego Museum to Steinermine in Switzerland to the Slotke's Vienna Doll and Toy Museum. Endless amounts of museums shutting down to the point that people started saying, are there any museums left? Yes. We're having a revitalization of the idea of doll museums again. And I think Barry Art Museum was really big in this and contributing to the idea as well that a doll museum doesn't even have to be just a doll museum. In this case, it's an art museum with a dedicated wing specifically towards dolls in a permanent collection. Then you have the Kansas City Toy and Miniature Museum. You have the UFDC Museum, also in Kansas City. More museums are opening back up in Europe as well. We are beginning to see this opportunity for the display of dolls to a new generation of the others, that I call it, who have not really been exposed to the three-dimensional artwork of dolls. And this is very exciting. And a number of pieces went to these museums across the world and will continue their journey as being showcases to the general public of the potential of the doll as art. So yay, museums, way to go. This is fabulous, and I'm really excited for it. Let me say one thing, though, that I believe in the end, while Rosalie would be so happy and excited to see this, and museums participating and taking on the next generation of display, she would be equally as happy as all of us should be that collectors are preserving these items, and collectors are ultimately some of the finest museums in the world. If you share your collection, it doesn't even have to be opening your house. It can be sharing them online. It can be doing videos of your collection, presentations on YouTube. It can be on Facebook, sharing with people different items that you love from it. All of these things do assist and help in presenting the doll as a work of art. And you really are, as a collector, presenting your own little museum that is a beautiful story that I know Rosalie appreciated and would want as well. The ninth takeaway from these landmark great events of 2024 and 25 of Rosalie Whyel was, as I was on the podium for the final few lots of part 2, this was seemingly what people would say is the end. And you would think there was sort of almost a sadness to this, but I thought this was a celebration, that it wasn't the end. This was really marking the next step, the next chapter, a new beginning for Rosalie's vision to be spread across the world. It really had me thinking that whenever these great landmark auctions finish, we talked about Shirley Temple, we talked about Millie Seeley, we talked about Rosalie Whyel. These auctions end. It's not the end. We're just turning a page. These dolls go on and they continue having that legacy and having that history. And that's why I believe an auction is not just selling stuff. An auction is cementing legacy. An auction is conveying the history and story that you had with that doll and bringing it to its next chapter and its next life. Long after we're all gone, these dolls will continue, and these dolls will have our presence and our protection with them, so that when we close an auction out, we don't just close the book, file it away, and never remember. It goes on forever. And I thought and feel that this will be the case for years to come. I imagine that 40, 50, 60 years from now, people will look back and they will say, oh, there was this incredible auction years ago. It was the Rosalie Whyel collection, and they'll tell the story of the museum. And this is a fabulous thing to remember for you as a collector in your building. What I called in takeaway number 1, the love, is that it helps your story to continue on and be told in such a positive and wonderful light as we've seen with Rosalie Whyel. And this is a beautiful, fitting turning of the page, not ending, to those weekends. Now, the final 10th takeaway of all of this is, well, I got to ask the question, what was up with a few things that Rosalie collected that she seemingly really had a fascination with that I didn't even know existed in one case? And that is, what was up with the pen wipers? And you're probably thinking, what? Pen wipers? Yes. In part 2, we displayed some of, I think there were 6 or 7 different variations of pen wipers. Now, I will start by saying that prior to this auction, part 2, I never even heard of a pen wiper. I didn't even know what a pen wiper did until I saw that Rosalie had a collection of a few of them. Apparently, it was a thing in the 19th century or whenever pen wipers were in or made. And I was laughing at this because I know a lot of strange things that we sell in the doll world, like, I'm selling stomachers, and I know what a skirt lifter is, which a lot of people don't. But I have to admit, I never, ever auctioned off a pen wiper before. And so I was laughing at that she introduced little genres like this that were really funny and fun for people. And then there were the sailors. That is, dolls in sailor costumes. What was up with that? Now, we know people do love French dolls, German dolls that have these period sailor costumes on them, but Rosalie had like 50 or 60, which is really astounding given that she grew up in the interior of Alaska, not exactly your sailor costume ground central. It's not as if there was much of a sailing community there, but she loved them. And it was really funny that nobody had ever recognized it. And I wondered if Rosalie really even knew how many dolls in sailor costumes she had. And I thought her daughter, Shelley, probably nailed it when she said, my mom probably loved them because it was the quintessential child's costume of the 19th and early 20th century. And she probably really got fixated on that being the classic outfit, but agreed she probably didn't even realize how many she had. So there was kind of a funny takeaway of the things. And I guess this is something that is really interesting about a collector is you may not even realize how you collected something or got zeroed in on a particular, let's say, style of costume until you go to sell your collection. And then it really kind of jumps out at that. It was a fascinating thing to witness, and a little light humor at the end of what is more of a deep analysis of 2 years of working with these dolls, this collection, and the 1 year of auctions we've had in these two parts that have, I think, taught us a great deal. They certainly have taught me a great deal that I hope has been conveyed to you here in perhaps helping your collecting in the future. Rosalie Whyel is an iconic figure, an iconic name that will continue on for generations and generations of collectors who will go back and look at her example and what she gave us, the importance of stories, the importance of recognizing items that may not be the classics, but to give them a home as well. The importance of diversifying your collection to recognize it can have different things even within the same genre. The importance of family support in your collecting. All of these things, I think, will be her legacy as we turn the page and turn the chapter to the next generation, as her dolls are spread across the world and join new homes, new museums. And that is ultimately it. If we have one last takeaway, it is that Rosalie was a protector, and she wanted to protect these pieces and share them with others. And now it's your turn.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.